The fork froze halfway to my lips the moment my mother slid two folded napkins across the linen-draped table toward my children. We were sitting in a Boston steakhouse, the kind of place where chandeliers hung like crystal icicles and every glass shimmered with candlelight. But in that instant, all the beauty felt like a cruel spotlight on humiliation. My son Ethan 10 blinked at the napkins as if they might magically unfold into food. My daughter Chloe, only 7, whispered in a voice that trembled with both hunger and confusion, "Mom, are napkins food?" The table erupted in a wave of laughter, sharp, cutting the kind of laughter that makes your skin prickle. My sister Vanessa smirked her manicured hand, stroking the blonde head of one of her daughters, who was already tearing into a $70 kids' meal complete with chicken tenders fries and a slice of cake. Across from me, Vanessa's husband Trevor leaned back, his grin spreading like grease across his face. He tipped his glass of red wine and said in a low voice meant for me alone, "Be grateful they were invited." The words landed like a slap. I felt Chloe's tiny hand clutch at my sleeve, searching for reassurance. But what could I say when my own voice was locked somewhere between fury and shame? My mother Margaret, with her pearls gleaming at her throat, didn't flinch. She sipped her wine, eyes trained on me with that familiar look that said, "Don't make this worse, Laura. Don't embarrass us." My father Charles stared down at his plate as though the pattern on the porcelain deserved more attention than his grandchildren being served napkins as dinner. The clatter of silverware seemed to mock me. I stared at those napkins and felt my chest burn with a heat I had been carrying for decades. All the sacrifices, all the quiet swallowing of insults, all the years of being treated as the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who pays. And here it was, again made flesh in two pathetic squares of folded paper. Ethan shifted in his seat, trying to pretend he wasn't hungry, while Chloe pushed her napkin back across the table with a brave little frown. "I don't want this," she said softly. Silence rippled. Even the waiter paused near the end of the table, sensing the tension. Vanessa's laugh cut through it high and mocking. "Don't be dramatic, Chloe. Share your mom's plate. That's what family does." Family. The word tasted like iron on my tongue. Trevor's voice oozed again. "Laura, don't look so shocked. You know how this works. Vanessa's girls are special. Everyone else, well, they should just be grateful for the invite." Something inside me cracked. My hand shot out, palm slamming against the polished mahogany. Glasses rattled and a streak of red wine spilled like blood across the white tablecloth. Every head turned. The hum of the restaurant dimmed as though the universe itself leaned closer to hear. My voice was steady but sharp enough to cut through bone. "Stop! Enough!" For the first time, Vanessa's smirk faltered. My mother's pearls trembled against her chest as her jaw tightened. "Laura," she whispered, her tone both warning and pleading, "don't make a scene." But the scene had already been made. My children's eyes were wide, their trust in me hanging by a thread. The humiliation that had been served with every family meal of my life had finally reached its last course. I straightened, every muscle rigid, every breath measured. I looked at Chloe, at Ethan, then at the napkins still lying untouched in front of them. And I knew, with a clarity that rang like church bells in my skull, this would not be another night I swallowed the insult. Tonight would be the night I drew the line. My name is Laura Mitchell, and at 42 years old, I never thought I would still be fighting for the simplest kind of dignity, being seen as a mother who could provide for her own children. By trade, I am a high school literature teacher. I spend my days guiding teenagers through Shakespeare, Morrison, and Steinbeck, teaching them how words can wound and heal, how silence can be a weapon and truth can be a sword. The irony is not lost on me that in my own family, silence has been my cage for decades. I live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Boston, the kind of place where you can hear the neighbors through the thin walls and where every bill requires careful planning. My life is measured not in extravagance, but in schedules, Ethan's soccer practice, Chloe's piano lessons, and the pile of essays waiting to be graded at midnight. My refrigerator is often stocked with leftovers, and my happiest splurge is a carton of strawberries when they're in season. I divorced 4 years ago after my husband decided fatherhood was optional and fidelity even more so. Since then, I have been both mother and father chauffeur and nurse teacher and disciplinarian. I stretch every paycheck to cover Brace's school supplies and shoes that seem to be outgrown the moment I buy them. Yet despite the constant strain, my children have never gone hungry under my roof. That is why the napkins at that steakhouse were not just paper, they were a public branding iron searing me with the accusation that I was less than enough. To the outside world, my family looks enviable. My mother, Margaret, maintains her image as the gracious matriarch always draped in pearls and speaking of tradition and sacrifice. My father, Charles, a retired accountant, spends most of his time watching sports in silence, content to let storms pass as long as they don't splash onto his shoes. My younger sister Vanessa, the so-called golden child, has curated a perfect life online: designer clothes, spotless children, and a husband who grins in every photo as though money were his personality. Behind closed doors, though, the truth is uglier. Tradition in my family has never meant love. It has meant Laura pays. It began small, as most forms of control do. In high school, I was expected to let Vanessa borrow my clothes, my money, my time. In college, my parents reminded me constantly that Vanessa needed more help because she was fragile, delicate, easily overwhelmed. By my 30s, I had become the family's invisible accountant, covering costs for Vanessa's emergencies, buying gifts on behalf of my parents when they didn't want to spend the money themselves paying babysitting fees that Trevor invented on the spot. My contributions were never acknowledged, they were expected. Gratitude was a foreign language at our table, and yet I kept quiet. Part of me believed that this was what being a good daughter meant: bearing the burden, keeping the peace, not making waves. But as I raised Ethan and Chloe, I began to see the cost of that silence. They watched me bite my tongue when Vanessa mocked me, watched me pay bills that weren't mine, watched me lower my head while others raised their voices. Children learn not only from what we say, but from what we endure. I realized with a sick weight in my stomach that I was teaching them how to accept humiliation. So I began to write it all down. Late at night, after grading papers, I filled journals with dates and details. Every time I was asked to cover a dinner bill, every Venmo request from Trevor, every cruel joke Vanessa made while my mother laughed. At first it felt petty, but soon it felt necessary. Words are evidence, and one day I told myself I would need that evidence. That night at the steakhouse, when napkins were pushed toward my children, the decades of documentation rushed back like a tide. Every entry in my journals became a stone in the foundation of a wall I was finally ready to build. My children deserved better. I deserved better. And for the first time in my life, I felt the steady, unshakable truth: silence was no longer protection. It was surrender. To understand the battlefield of that steakhouse table, you need to know the soldiers seated around it, the ones who have worn me down for decades while smiling for holiday photos. My mother, Margaret, has always been the general. At 68, she carries herself like royalty draped in pearls, her hair set in weekly salon curls, her voice soft and poisonous at once. She believes in appearances above all else. To the neighbors, she is the generous hostess who bakes pies and donates to the church. To me, she is the voice that has whispered since childhood, "Be grateful, Laura. You could have it worse." Whenever Vanessa stumbled, it was my mother's hands that reached out to steady her. My hands were used only to clean up the mess. My father, Charles, is the ghost at the table. 71 years old, retired accountant, he hides behind the glow of sports channels and Sudoku puzzles. He has always believed that silence is neutrality, but silence is never neutral. It is endorsement. When Trevor once shoved my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise, my father adjusted his glasses and said nothing. When Vanessa sneered that my divorce was proof of my failure, my father kept cutting his steak. His quiet has been a drumbeat of betrayal my whole life. Then there is Vanessa, 38, my mother's masterpiece. With her platinum highlights, her curated Instagram feed, her expensive yoga retreats, she has perfected the art of being the golden child. She weaponizes fragility, pretending to be overwhelmed by the smallest of tasks while living off the labor of others. Vanessa has never worked a full-time job for more than a year, yet she is praised as creative and free-spirited. I, on the other hand, have taught for 20 years and am dismissed as responsible in the same tone one might describe a boring appliance. To Vanessa, my role is clear: the supporting character who bankrolls her spotlight. And Trevor, oh Trevor, If my mother is the general, he is the executioner. A salesman by profession, he is fluent in manipulation. His smile is wide, his charm is rehearsed, but underneath lies cruelty sharp as broken glass. He is the kind of man who sends a Venmo request for $42.50 after babysitting for 2 hours, who boasts about upgrading his SUV while mocking me for driving a used sedan, who once jokingly blocked my path in the kitchen and shoved me aside when I tried to move past. He insists he is part of our family's inner circle, but the only currency he brings is debt and disdain. Together, they form a coalition of control bound by unspoken rules. Vanessa is untouchable. Trevor is tolerated because he protects Vanessa. My mother enforces the hierarchy, and my father legitimizes it with silence. I am cast as the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who pays. Every gathering reinforces these roles. At birthdays, I buy the cake. At Christmas, I purchase the gifts my parents take credit for. At summer barbecues, I stock the drinks while Trevor lectures me on the importance of financial planning. The injustice is baked into every ritual. And yet, if you walked past our table at that steakhouse, you might have thought we were a family of warmth and laughter. Vanessa snapped photos of her daughters biting into their cake. My mother raised her glass in toasts about gratitude. Trevor winked at the waiter as if tipping generously made him a king. From the outside, it was a portrait of harmony. From my seat, it was a stage play of cruelty. That night, as my children sat with napkins instead of meals, the roles tightened like a noose. My mother expected me to remain quiet. My father expected me to remain invisible. Vanessa expected me to pay. Trevor expected me to accept humiliation as if it were the cost of admission to their table. But I was no longer willing to play my part. The stage lights were too bright, the script too cruel, and for once I was ready to throw the script into the fire. The steakhouse air grew heavy the moment the waiter approached with the leather-bound bill. I could see it in the set of my mother's shoulders, in the twitch of Vanessa's lips, in the smug lean of Trevor's body against the back of his chair. The ritual was about to begin, and everyone knew their lines. The waiter placed the folder gently at the head of the table between my mother and father, but Margaret slid it toward herself with a delicate hand and a serene smile. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She turned her eyes toward me and nodded once a signal as old as my adulthood. The unspoken decree, Laura will handle it. Vanessa didn't even bother hiding her satisfaction. She dabbed her mouth with her napkin and murmured to her daughters, "Don't forget to thank Aunt Laura for dinner, loud enough for me to hear, but soft enough to sound like sweetness." Trevor chuckled, raising his glass in mock salute. "Our accountant strikes again," he said, his grin wide, his voice dripping with ridicule, always keeping the family balanced. The muscles in my jaw ached from clenching. I could feel Ethan stiffen beside me, his small hands fisted in his lap. Chloe's eyes darted to mine, searching for an answer to a question she hadn't yet learned to phrase. "Mom, why do they treat us this way?" I reached for my water glass, hoping the cool liquid would wash down the fury rising like bile in my throat, but it only burned hotter. My mother set her napkin on the table with elegance, as though preparing to give a speech. "Laura has always been our steady one," she said warmly to the table, her voice the perfect blend of praise and dismissal. "We're blessed to have her. Vanessa has such a sensitive spirit. Trevor works so hard. Laura is the rock, the reliable one." She turned her gaze on me, eyes hard beneath the softness of her smile. "We can always count on you, darling. Can't we?" It wasn't a question. It was a command dressed as flattery. For a heartbeat, I nearly obeyed. Years of conditioning tightened around me like barbed wire. I pictured reaching for the bill, sliding my card inside, smiling as though I was grateful to provide. The image was so familiar, it felt like muscle memory. But then, Chloe's small voice whispered again, echoing through my skull. "Mom, our napkins, food, the shame. The laughter, the decades of invoices and bruises and silence, they crashed together like thunder in my chest." Trevor leaned forward, his grin feral. "Come on, Laura, don't ruin the evening. Be grateful we invited you. It's tradition." That word again. Tradition. Their tradition was humiliation disguised as family. Their tradition was servitude disguised as gratitude. Something inside me snapped so loudly I swore the chandelier rattled overhead. I laid both palms flat on the table. The impact silenced even the faint clinking of glasses from nearby diners. Red wine trembled in crystal stems, the flickering candlelight catching in the liquid like blood. Every pair of eyes locked on me, some in surprise, others in warning. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried like a blade through fog. "Not this time." Vanessa's fork clattered onto her plate. My mother's smile froze cracks, spreading across its porcelain surface. Charles shifted in his chair, uncomfortable but mute as always. Trevor's smirk faltered, then returned sharper, meaner. "Don't be petty, Laura. We're family. Family means sacrifice." I turned my gaze on him, steady and unflinching. "Family doesn't mean servitude." The waiter lingered uncertainly at the edge of the table, sensing a storm. My children watched me with wide eyes, and in that moment I realized something undeniable. This was no longer about money or dinners or even decades of injustice. This was about teaching Ethan and Chloe that their mother would not bow, that they had permission to stand tall, that dignity was worth the fight. The trigger had been pulled. There would be no returning to silence. It's easy for outsiders to think an explosion like mine at that table comes from nowhere, that one dinner gone sour pushed a woman past her breaking point. But no eruption happens without years of pressure building under the surface. No volcano erupts without decades of molten fire waiting in the dark. My breaking point had been written long before that night. It was carved into me by 1,000 small cuts and a few deep wounds that never truly healed. I was 14 the first time I understood what my role in this family would be. Vanessa was preparing for prom, all glittering excitement and wide-eyed entitlement. She had chosen a dress far beyond what my parents could afford, but instead of telling her no, my mother turned to me. "Laura," she said sweetly, "you've been saving from babysitting, haven't you? Be a good sister. Lend Vanessa the money. She'll pay you back, of course." Vanessa twirled in the mirror, not even bothering to thank me, as I handed over the crumpled bills I had worked all summer to earn. She never repaid me. Instead, she posted photos of herself draped on Trevor's arm in that shimmering gown while I wore a thrift store dress and sat in the corner with a boy who barely remembered my name. In college, I worked 2 jobs tutoring and shelving books at the library. My parents would call late at night, their voices urgent. "Vanessa's tuition is a little short this semester," my mother would say. "She's under so much stress." "You're stronger, Laura. You can handle a little sacrifice." And so, my checks disappeared into Vanessa's classes and her rent while I skipped meals and lived in a drafty apartment with broken heat. Every time I confronted her, she would tilt her head and say, "You're so dramatic." Family helps family. That phrase became a weapon slicing away at my dignity year after year. When I married, I thought perhaps things would shift. I was wrong. Vanessa and Trevor had been together since their early 20s, and from the start, he tested my boundaries. At a Christmas dinner, he slid a bill across the table, a handwritten list of expenses from babysitting Ethan, who was barely 2 at the time. $40, he said with a grin, plus 2 Gatorades from your fridge. Gotta keep it fair. My parents laughed as though it were charming. I wrote the check with shaking hands, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. The violence crept in quietly. One summer barbecue, Trevor cornered me in the kitchen while the others laughed outside. He blocked the doorway with his broad shoulders smirking. "You always think you're better than us, don't you?" he said. I tried to brush past him, but he shoved me against the counter hard enough that my shoulder bruised. Later, when I showed my mother the purple mark, she waved it away. "He didn't mean it, Laura. Don't be dramatic. You know how sensitive Vanessa is. Don't ruin her marriage over something small." My father sat silent in his recliner, eyes fixed on the television. That was the night I learned my pain was less important than Vanessa's comfort. Through the years, the exploitation continued like clockwork. Vanessa's emergencies multiplied car repairs, spa retreats she called therapy yoga teacher certifications she never used. My parents co-signed loans in my name without asking, insisting it was for the good of the family. Every holiday ended with me footing the bill while Vanessa posted glossy Instagram stories with captions like, "So blessed." I became the invisible scaffolding propping up her life, never acknowledged, never thanked. Even after my divorce, when I was drowning in bills and juggling 2 kids alone, the requests didn't stop. Trevor once called me at midnight, slurring from drink, demanding I transfer him money for an Uber. "You're the responsible one, Laura," he said. "Don't let your little sister worry. Handle it." I sent the money, tears burning my eyes, because I knew the cost of saying no would be greater. Refusal meant exile, guilt, endless phone calls reminding me how much my parents had sacrificed for me. Gaslighting became their language. Whenever I pushed back, my mother would sigh dramatically. "Be grateful you're included, Laura. So many families don't stay close. We're lucky." My father would mutter, "Don't start something." Vanessa would roll her eyes. Trevor would smirk, reminding me of every invoice, every dollar he claimed I owed. They rewrote history in real time, convincing me that my sacrifices were privileges, that my humiliation was love. But the truth was written in my journals. I recorded every Venmo request, every bruising word, every moment I bit my tongue while my children watched. Page after page of evidence that I was not crazy, not dramatic, not ungrateful, simply trapped in a cycle of control. The worst memory came just a year before that steakhouse dinner. Vanessa had insisted on a lavish vacation to Martha's Vineyard, inviting the whole family. "It'll be healing," she said. I declined, explaining I couldn't afford it. Days later, Trevor appeared at my door with a printed invoice, half the rental cost, claiming my parents had already booked, and I was obligated to pay. When I refused, he shoved the paper against my chest so hard the edge cut my skin. I still have the faint scar. My children were standing behind me wide-eyed as he spat. "You'll regret this, Laura. Don't think you can walk away." That scar burned as I sat at the steakhouse, my children staring at napkins where food should have been. It reminded me that this wasn't just about money. It was about power, about control enforced through humiliation and at times through violence. Every flashback surged through me like a wave, and I felt the tide turning at last. This was no longer about keeping peace. It was about survival, about teaching Ethan and Chloe that love is not measured in bruises or invoices or forced gratitude. It was about breaking the chain before it strangled another generation. By the time the waiter set down that bill, I wasn't just a daughter or a sister. I was a woman carrying the weight of every wound they had inflicted, ready to finally set it down and let it crash where it belonged on their shoulders. The bill sat between us like a loaded weapon, silent but lethal. My mother's hand hovered near it. Her nails painted a perfect pearl pink to match the string around her neck. She didn't touch the folder she didn't have to. The weight of expectation pressed down heavier than any hand. I could almost hear the script she had rehearsed for me since childhood. "Laura, just take care of it. Be the steady one. Don't ruin the evening." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine as if she were starring in her own movie, confident the world would bend to her whims. "Do you know what's so wonderful about tradition?" she said lightly. Her voice aimed at me but crafted for the audience of our parents. "It makes life predictable. Safe. Everyone knows their role. Don't you think, Laura?" Trevor chuckled at her side, his arm draped across the back of her chair, eyes locked on me with the smug satisfaction of a man who believes the ending has already been written. My father shifted, coughed into his napkin, and avoided my gaze. His silence had always been his shield, but tonight it felt like a verdict. Ethan's leg bumped against mine under the table, jittering with nervous energy. Chloe clutched my hand, her small fingers damp with sweat. Their bodies told me what their mouths couldn't. They were waiting to see if I would protect them or fold yet again. I inhaled slowly, the air thick with the scent of steak and garlic butter and red wine. It should have been a night of warmth, of family, of tradition in the truest sense. Instead, it was a stage play where my children had been cast as beggars, my role written as the fool who pays for her own humiliation. My heart thudded so loudly I feared they would hear it. My mind replayed the flashbacks in quick succession. The prom dress, the unpaid debts, the invoices, the bruises, the scar. Every memory stacked like bricks, building a wall I could no longer scale. One sentence I whispered to myself. My journals, my evidence, my long years of silence had all led me to this. One sentence would be enough to tear down the stage they had built on my back. My mother tilted her head, that polished smile tightening. Laura, dear, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just do what you always do. Keep the family together. Trevor smirked, lifting his glass. Copy that, Laura. Be the hero. Pay the bill. Let's keep the peace. My fingers curled against the table nails, biting into the polished wood. Ethan's eyes searched mine, pleading without words. Chloe leaned closer, whispering Mom so softly it nearly broke me. I sat straighter. My pulse steadied not from calm, but from clarity. For the first time in years, I felt the script slip from my hands. I was no longer the supporting character. I was about to claim the stage. The waiter returned, hovering with polite uncertainty, clearly sensing the tension. "Shall I take care of this for you?" he asked gently. "Yes," I said, my voice slicing clean through the room. "But tonight we're doing it differently." Every head turned, glasses stilled. The moment had arrived. The air in the steakhouse shifted the second my words fell. Conversations at nearby tables dipped, the clatter of plates seemed to hush, and the waiter's pen hovered in midair, as if even he wasn't sure what I meant. For years, I had played the role they wrote for me, the dependable one, the quiet one, the wallet. But not tonight. "I'd like the bill split," I said, my voice steady as stone. "By who ordered what?" Vanessa's laugh was instant, sharp, brittle. "Laura, that's what's the word tacky. Who does that at a family dinner?" Trevor leaned forward, eyes gleaming, his voice loud enough to draw glances from the next table. "This is petty Laura. You sound cheap. It's embarrassing." I met his gaze without flinching. What's embarrassing is giving napkins to children and calling it dinner. A flush crawled up his neck. "Don't exaggerate. They could have shared. You've always been dramatic." "No," I said firmly. "I've always been silent. There's a difference." My mother placed her hand flat on the table, her smile trembling at the edges. "Laura, be reasonable. This is tradition. Every family has someone who steps up, who sacrifices a little more. You've always been that person. You should be proud." I turned to her, my voice cooling like steel. "Sacrifice is a choice. Slavery is not. I never chose this." The waiter cleared his throat pin, still poised. "So, split evenly or itemized?" "Itemized," I answered, never breaking eye contact with my mother. The silence that followed was volcanic. Vanessa's face tightened, her veneer of elegance cracking. Trevor muttered something under his breath, fists clenched around his glass. My father shifted uncomfortably but said nothing as always. When the waiter read back the totals, the numbers hung in the air like judgment. For Ms. Mitchell, 2 sodas children's sides, $42. For Mr. and Mrs. Trevor and Vanessa steak dinners, wine flights, 2 children's meals appetizers, $287. For Mr. and Mrs. Charles and Margaret shared entree bottle of wine, $112. The waiter slid the folder toward me. For the first time in decades, I didn't pick it up. I pushed it toward Trevor and Vanessa. "That's yours. Pay it." "Pay it." Trevor's laugh was hollow and credulous. "You can't be serious." I leaned forward, my voice low but razor sharp. "You shoved me against a counter once and called it a joke. You sent me invoices for babysitting my own children. You cut me and told me I'd regret saying no. I'm done financing your life. Pay your bill." Gasps rippled around the table. My mother hissed, "Laura, don't drag private matters into public." "They made it public when they humiliated my kids with napkins." My voice rose no longer quiet. "They made it public when they turned me into the family scapegoat. Tonight, I end it." Ethan's eyes lit with something I hadn't seen before, pride. Chloe squeezed my hand tighter, whispering, "Go, Mom." Trevor slammed his glass down, the sound cracking through the room. "You think you're a hero? You're pathetic. Without us, you'd have nothing." I stared at him, letting every ounce of fury I had collected over decades harden in my eyes. "Without me, you'd have no vacations, no bills covered, no easy target. Tonight you pay your own way, Trevor, and from this day forward you never touch my wallet again." The waiter, sensing danger, quickly passed out the itemized slips. Trevor snatched his hands shaking, while Vanessa hissed at him, "Just pay it. People are staring." My mother's face blanched, her pearls trembling as her chest rose and fell. I signed my modest slip, scrawling my name with a flourish that felt like freedom. I handed it back to the waiter and looked at my children. "Let's go." As I rose, chairs scraped against the hardwood. Vanessa called after me, her voice high-pitched and panicked. "You'll regret this, Laura. Don't you dare walk out on your family." I turned at the doorway, the glow of the chandeliers behind me, my children at my side. My voice carried across the hushed dining room. I'm not walking out on family, I'm walking out on tyrants. With that, I left them staring at one another across a table littered with spilled wine, cold steaks, and 2 untouched napkins that still lay folded where my mother had placed them. The restaurant seemed to exhale the moment I walked away, as though it too had been holding its breath. Behind me, however, chaos erupted. I could hear it even as the waiter ushered Ethan and Chloe toward the door. Voices rose sharp and frantic, cutting through the clink of dishes and the murmur of other diners who had already turned their heads to watch the spectacle unfold. Vanessa's voice came first shrill with disbelief. "Do you see what she just did? She humiliated us in public. She embarrassed this family in front of strangers." Her hands flailed as though she could wave away the stain I had left behind, but no gesture could erase the silence that had followed my declaration. Trevor slammed the slip of paper onto the table. "Almost $300. She's delusional if she thinks I'm paying for all this. We came here as a family. Families split the burden." My mother's tone cracked like a whip. "No, Laura has always carried the burden. She knows her place. Tonight, she lost her mind. She'll come crawling back, you'll see." Her pearls trembled against her chest as her composure threatened to shatter. The word place lingered in the air like smoke, the revelation of what she truly thought of me. My father muttered something barely audible, his voice coated with unease. "Maybe she's right, Margaret. Maybe we—" But Margaret silenced him with a glare sharp enough to slice. He dropped his eyes back to his plate, chewing on shame, as though it were tough meat. Trevor snatched his credit card from his wallet with theatrical anger, throwing it into the leather folder so hard the waiter flinched. "Fine, but she'll pay for this, one way or another." Vanessa's eyes glistened with tears, mascara streaking her cheeks. Why does she always ruin everything? Every time we try to celebrate, she makes it about herself. She's selfish. Selfish. The word twisted in the air, a grotesque inversion of truth. The selfish one was the sister who demanded and demanded, who lived off the sacrifices of others, who never once offered gratitude. Yet Vanessa had convinced herself that victimhood was her crown, and she wore it proudly. Other diners whispered. Some shook their heads, others stared openly. A woman at a nearby table murmured, "Good for her," not realizing I was still close enough to hear. That quiet solidarity echoed louder than all the accusations behind me. The waiter returned his face carefully neutral and collected the payments. Margaret waved him off with shaking hands, muttering about ungrateful daughters and broken families. Trevor signed his receipt with a scrawl that tore the paper, while Vanessa dabbed her eyes with trembling fingers, lamenting her ruined evening. But the damage wasn't confined to the bill. Something larger had cracked. The mask of family unity they had worn so tightly had slipped, and in its place was a portrait of ugliness the world could finally glimpse. Strangers had seen it. My children had seen it. And for the first time, they had to confront the truth that perhaps their golden hierarchy was nothing more than rot polished to a shine. As I pushed open the heavy restaurant doors, the cool night air rushing over my skin, I knew that the fallout had only begun. That table, once the throne of my mother's authority and Vanessa's entitlement, had become a stage of their undoing. And though their voices still echoed behind me, angry, desperate, gasping for control, I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I walked away without paying for their chaos. The fallout at the restaurant was only the beginning. By the time I tucked Ethan and Chloe into bed that night, my phone was already buzzing with messages, each one dripping with the venom of a family scrambling to rewrite history. The group chat lit up at 11:07 p.m. Vanessa's first message exploded across the screen. "You humiliated us tonight. In front of strangers. In front of my children." Then another seconds later, "You've always been jealous of me. Admit it." Trevor followed with his own barrage. "You stuck me with a $287 bill. You owe us. I expect a transfer tomorrow. Don't play games." A Venmo request pinged into my notifications almost instantly, $18.72 labeled bread plus apps. The petty cruelty of it made me laugh bitterly in the dark of my bedroom. After all the years of covering vacations, spa retreats, and fake emergencies here, he was demanding less than $20 as though it would reassert control. My mother's messages came last, written with the polished cruelty she had perfected over decades. "Laura, I am ashamed of you, Be grateful you were even invited. Do you know how this looked? To everyone in that restaurant, you embarrassed me. You embarrassed our name. You embarrassed your father. Another pause. Then the final twist of the knife. Apologize tomorrow, and perhaps I'll forgive you. I stared at those words until the letters blurred. Perhaps I'll forgive you, as if her forgiveness were a currency I should beg for, as if my decades of sacrifice meant nothing against one night of defiance. My chest burned with the injustice of it. For years, I had been the quiet banker of this family's sins, and now they acted as if I had robbed them. The voicemails were worse. Trevor's voice slurred with rage. You think you're brave? You think you can humiliate me in public and walk away? You'll regret this, Laura. I'll make sure of it. Then Vanessa's sobbing tones. Why do you hate me? Why do you always try to take away my happiness? You ruined our night. You ruined everything. And finally, my mother's quiet, sharp whisper. Don't make this worse, Laura. Do the right thing. Pay Trevor back. Say sorry, or you'll regret it. I deleted none of them. Instead, I wrote down the timestamps in my journal, just as I had for years. Words are evidence. Someday I knew I would need proof not only for myself, but for Ethan and Chloe to show them that the truth was not what the family painted, but what they had lived through. The next morning, my mother arrived at my apartment with a Tupperware of cookies, her performance rehearsed to perfection. She pressed the plastic container into my hands, her eyes glistening. Let's not make this bigger than it is, darling. Families fight. Families forgive. You've always been too sensitive. Take these, give the children a treat, and call your sister. Say you're sorry. Her words churned my stomach, but I smiled tightly. Thank you for the cookies, I said. I carried them to the freezer, shoved them deep into the back, and shut the door. Rage cookies are still cookies, but I wouldn't let her weaponize them. When I turned back, my voice was steady. No group bills anymore. No invoices. No fake emergencies. I will pay for what I order and who I bring. That's it. Margaret's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. That's not how families work. I met her gaze without flinching. Then maybe this family doesn't work. She gasped, clutched at her pearls as though I had physically struck her, and stormed out with the cookies still locked in my freezer. That week, the calls didn't stop. My father left a voicemail mumbling about keeping the peace. Vanessa posted a thinly veiled Instagram story, a boomerang of clinking champagne glasses captioned, Real families know loyalty. Trevor tagged me in a meme about freeloaders. The smear campaign was underway, designed to isolate me, to shame me back into silence. But for the first time, their noise didn't shake me. Each message, each petty invoice, each manipulative post was not proof of my guilt. It was evidence of their rot. I cataloged it all, not with the desperation of someone clinging to sanity, but with the calm determination of someone preparing for battle. And beneath all the chaos, a new clarity bloomed. The napkins on that table had not been humiliation. They had been the spark. For weeks, I let them dig their own graves. Every text message, every voicemail, every petty Venmo request became a brick in the wall of evidence I was building. I cataloged everything in the same meticulous way I graded Essay's date time sender exact wording. The more they tried to shame me, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just exploitation. It was harassment, and in Trevor's case, it was violence. Late one night after tucking Ethan and Chloe into bed, I spread my journals across the dining table. The pages stretched back, nearly 2 decades ink-stained records of debts-demanded insults thrown moments of bruised silence. My fingers traced the lines that detailed the shove in the kitchen, the cut from the Martha's Vineyard invoice, the bruise I once photographed in secret. For years, I thought keeping these records made me obsessive. Now I saw it for what it was: survival. I made an appointment with Denise, a lawyer recommended by a colleague at school. She was sharp-eyed in her 50s with the kind of presence that made men like Trevor squirm. I slid the journals across her desk, followed by printouts of texts and screenshots of Venmo requests. I played her the voicemails where Trevor's voice slurred with threats and my mother's hissed about regret. Denise listened without interrupting her pen, moving quickly across yellow legal paper. When the last voicemail ended, she looked up, her gaze steady. Laura, this isn't family drama. This is harassment. And Trevor, that's assault. You've got enough here to bring both civil and criminal action. The words landed like a gavel in my chest. For the first time, I felt the ground tilt in my favor. We filed a petition for a protective order against Trevor, citing not only the physical shove, but also the ongoing financial harassment. Denise also filed a motion to compel repayment of funds documented in my journal's loans and invoices I had covered over the years without consent. We won't get everything back, she warned, but we'll get enough to make the point, and we'll make it public. Court day came sooner than I expected. I stood in a small fluorescent-lit room with Denise at my side, my hands trembling, but my resolve steel. Trevor arrived in his expensive suit, smirk still plastered across his face, Vanessa clutching his arm. My mother swept in wearing her pearls, her expression dripping with false martyrdom. My father trailed behind, eyes on the floor. When the judge asked for evidence, Denise laid it out like a scalpel. Screenshots of Trevor's Venmo requests labeled Uber for me and babysitting invoice. Photos of my bruised shoulder, the scar from the paper cut pressed against my chest. Voicemails where Trevor hissed, "You'll regret this," and my mother whispered, "Pay him back or you'll be sorry." The journals, page after page of my handwriting, detailed and undeniable. Trevor tried to laugh it off. "Your Honor, this is family business. She's just bitter. She wants attention." The judge's gavel struck once. Silence. Then his gaze fixed on Trevor. Family business does not excuse harassment. It does not excuse violence. And it does not excuse theft disguised as tradition. The protective order was granted. Trevor was ordered to repay several documented sums within 90 days. His smug grin cracked when the judge added, "And let me be clear, if you contact Ms. Mitchell outside of legal counsel, you will face criminal charges." My mother gasped, clutching her pearls, but the judge was not done. "Mrs. Mitchell enabling harassment is complicity. Consider yourself warned." When it was over, Vanessa rushed from the courtroom, mascara streaking her cheeks, while Trevor barked into his phone about ruined reputations. Margaret refused to look at me. Charles shuffled behind them, silent as ever. I walked out with Denise, the autumn air crisp against my face. Ethan and Chloe were waiting with a friend outside the courthouse. When Chloe ran into my arms and Ethan asked, "Did we win, Mom?" I knelt down and smiled. Yes, we won. It wasn't just victory, it was justice. Justice didn't stop at the gavel's strike. Consequences have a way of rippling outward, catching those who once believed themselves untouchable. Within weeks, Trevor's carefully curated life began to unravel. The repayment order hit him hardest. 2 decades of petty invoices and so-called favors had added up. Denise had carefully documented nearly $14,000 in transfers receipts and emergency costs that I had shouldered. The judge's mandate forced him to return every penny. Vanessa had to sell her luxury SUV once paraded online as proof of her perfect life just to cover part of the debt. The humiliation was public. Whispers spread through their social circle, once dazzled by Trevor's swagger, now entertained by his disgrace. At his job in sales, Trevor's reputation soured. A protective order is not something that hides quietly. Colleagues whispered, clients withdrew, and soon his manager pulled him aside. By the end of the quarter, Trevor was placed on probation at work. For a man who had lived on charm and intimidation, the sudden fracture in his image was more devastating than the financial loss. His smile no longer opened doors, it raised questions. Vanessa, stripped of her shield, floundered. Her social media followers noticed the absence of lavish vacations, the lack of glossy posts featuring new handbags or champagne toasts. She attempted to spin the narrative painting me as jealous and vindictive, but the court documents were public record. Screenshots circulated quietly in community Facebook groups, Venmo requests, invoices, messages where she mocked me while taking my money. Golden Child lost its shine. Even her closest friends pulled away, unwilling to be associated with a sinking ship. My mother's consequences were quieter, but just as piercing. Margaret had spent decades cultivating the image of the benevolent matriarch. Church groups, neighbors, even distant relatives saw her as gracious, loving, selfless. But in the wake of the hearing, her complicity was impossible to hide. When word spread that she had dismissed Trevor's violence, that she had pressured me to cover debts in Vanessa's name, her authority crumbled. At Sunday service, whispers followed her down the aisle. At the market, women she once called friends looked away. Respect, once her crown, dissolved into suspicion. And my father, he remained what he had always been, silent. but silence now cost him. Without Margaret's shield of admiration, he looked less like a quiet man avoiding conflict and more like a coward who had enabled cruelty with his passivity. The world finally saw what I had lived, a father who watched his daughter suffer and said nothing. For me, the consequences were different. For the first time, the balance tipped in my favor. My paycheck was mine again. My evenings were not filled with panic about covering someone else's emergency. Ethan and Chloe noticed first. At the grocery store, Chloe pointed at a box of strawberries and asked timidly, "Can we?" I dropped them in the cart without hesitation. Ethan's eyes widened, then softened. He didn't say anything, but his smile was worth more than every dollar I had ever lost to Vanessa and Trevor. Freedom, I realized, was not only about money. It was about breathing without fear of the next demand, the next insult, the next invoice. It was about walking into my own home and knowing it was truly mine. For my family, the consequences were ruin. For me, they were release. Healing did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces like sunlight slipping through the cracks of blinds after a long night. For weeks after the court hearing, I found myself waiting for the next demand, the next poisonous message, the next knock on the door. But it never came. Their silence, once my prison, had become my liberation. Ethan noticed first. "Mom," he said one Saturday morning as we flipped pancakes in the kitchen, "nobody's asking you for money anymore." His voice was light, but beneath it was the relief of a child who had watched his mother carry weights he couldn't name. I ruffled his hair and smiled. "That's right, and nobody ever will again." Chloe, her cheeks dusted with flour, chimed in, "Because you said no, and no is strong." Those words became our mantra. I painted them on a small canvas and hung it above the kitchen table. No is strong. Every time I saw it, I remembered the steakhouse, the napkins, the laughter and the silence that nearly swallowed me whole. And every time I remembered that I had walked out. But healing wasn't just personal, it became communal. With Denise's encouragement, I began speaking at a local women's support group. At first, I shared hesitantly, my voice trembling as I recounted years of invoices and bruises dismissed as small things. But faces around me nodded tears. Welled hands reached out. I wasn't alone. My story was not unique. It was part of a larger pattern that thrived in silence. Together, we dismantled that silence. From those meetings grew something more concrete. I launched a small nonprofit, Boundaries First, dedicated to helping single mothers untangle themselves from toxic family financial traps. We provided workshops on financial literacy legal clinics for those facing harassment, and a support line staffed by women who had lived it. What began as my personal survival bloomed into a mission that touched dozens of lives. The irony wasn't lost on me when my mother tried to attend one of the early sessions. She arrived with her pearls and a tin of cookies, her face painted in the familiar mask of a martyr. I accepted the cookies politely and set them aside with the others. Rage cookies were still cookies, but they no longer had power over me. When she asked if we could talk, I shook my head. "Not today. Not until you can admit what you did." She left in silence, and for once it was her silence, not mine, that carried the weight of regret. As for Vanessa and Trevor, their downfall was public and undeniable. Their social circle shrank. Trevor's job slipped through his fingers. Vanessa's curated Instagram dissolved into long absences and hollow captions. Occasionally, a new account would appear online, mocking me, hinting at revenge, but Denise's warning and the protective order kept them at bay. Their power was gone, and without me as their scapegoat, they had only each other to devour. The last piece of healing came quietly on a Sunday morning in autumn. Ethan sat on the porch, reading To Kill a Mockingbird, his brow furrowed in concentration. Chloe knelt in the grass, weaving clovers into a chain. I sipped coffee and watched them, the air, crisp, the world, peaceful. For the first time in decades, I felt free. Not just from my family's grip, but from the story they had written for me. Because in the end, I was not the dependable one, the steady one, the scapegoat, or the servant. I was the woman who said no. I was the mother who stood up. I was the survivor who turned humiliation into power. And as Chloe lifted her chain of clovers and placed it on my head, giggling, "You're the queen now, Mom," I laughed through tears. For once, she was right.